The winter of 1956 was not a good time to own a large car in Britain. The Suez Crisis had brought the country to the edge of an energy emergency, and by December the government had introduced petrol rationing, the first time British drivers had faced coupons at the pump since the Second World War had ended a decade earlier. A standard allocation of around 90 miles worth of fuel per month. A country that had been slowly, cautiously beginning to enjoy the post-war prosperity it had been promised was now being told firmly that the party had not quite started yet. Against that backdrop, someone at General Motors' Luton headquarters was signing off on a car that would arrive at the 1957 Earl's Court Motor Show wearing panoramic wraparound glass, two-tone paint in colours that had no business being called anything other than American, vestigial tailfins rising from the rear quarters, and a width that required most drivers to make a genuine decision about which side of a country lane they were willing to sacrifice. The car was the Vauxhall Cresta PA, and by the time it went on sale, petrol rationing had just ended, in May of 1957, which meant that the timing was, depending on your perspective, either perfectly judged or magnificently oblivious. There is something particular about the Cresta that rewards a second look. On first encounter, it appears to be a simple story, a British manufacturer chasing American fashion, producing a car that was too wide, too shiny, and too aspirational for the roads it was going to spend its life on. That reading is not entirely wrong, but it misses what the Cresta actually was to the people who bought it, what it said about the Britain it arrived in, and why, more than 60 years later, a well-preserved example still stops a room at a classic car show in a way that its more celebrated contemporaries sometimes do not. There is also one specific thing about how this car came to exist and who precisely was making the decisions that casts everything else in a different light. We will get to it. The world the Cresta arrived. In to understand why a car like the Cresta made sense in 1957 Britain, you have to understand what post-war prosperity actually looked like for the people who were beginning to feel it for the first time. The austerity years had not ended tidily. Rationing of various kinds had continued well into the early 1950s. New car ownership had been, for most of the previous decade, either impossible or actively discouraged by a government that wanted exported vehicles earning foreign currency rather than domestically registered ones sitting on British driveways. The cars that most British families drove in the mid-1950s, when they drove at all, were small, upright, functionally designed machines that carried the aesthetic logic of the 1940s, because many of them were, in fact, still 1940s designs. By 1957, something was shifting. Harold Macmillan would tell the country the following year that most people had never had it so good, a line so memorable it has followed him through history. And while the full prosperity he was describing was still unevenly distributed, the direction of travel was unmistakable. People who had grown up in the Depression and survived the war were reaching middle age with incomes that, for the first time, allowed them to make choices. A detached house, a television, a car that was not merely transportation, but a statement about where you stood and where you were going. The question was, what did aspiration look like in 1957 Britain? The answer, decisively, was American. American films were filling the cinemas. By the late 1950s, Hollywood product dominated British screens in a way that has never quite been matched before or since. American music was arriving via Radio Luxembourg after the BBC's careful scheduling had ended for the night. American consumer goods were reaching British shops, and American cars, those extraordinary chromium-laden finned and fluted machines that seemed to have been designed by people who believed that elegance and excess were the same thing, were visible enough in newsreels and magazines to have become the symbol of what modernity looked like if you were doing it properly. The men who bought Vauxhall Crestas in 1957 and 58 were not buying a substitute for something they couldn't afford. They were buying something that carried, in its styling, a specific cultural message, that the buyer had made it, that the hard years were behind them, and that they intended to travel through their lives with a degree of style that their fathers had never been offered. These were commercial travelers and branch managers and small business owners and senior clerks. They were driving cars that their neighbors noticed. And the Cresta gave them something to be noticed in, what Vauxhall actually built. The PA Cresta did not come from nowhere. It came from Detroit, or more precisely, from the design philosophies that General Motors had been developing throughout the early 1950s under Harley Earl, the man who had essentially invented the role of the automotive designer and who had spent 2 decades demonstrating that a car's shape was as important as its engineering. Vauxhall had been a General Motors subsidiary since 1925, and by the mid-1950s the relationship between Luton and Detroit was close enough that styling influence flowed across the Atlantic with regularity. The PA was the most direct expression of that influence that Vauxhall had yet produced. The panoramic windscreen, a curved, wraparound sheet of glass that gave the driver a field of vision that the previous generation of upright British cars had never offered, was a direct inheritance from GM's American design language. The two-tone paint combinations offered in pairings that put a lighter color on the roof against a deeper shade on the lower body were the same logic that was selling Chevrolets and Oldsmobiles in showrooms across the United States. The rear fins, modest by American standards, which is roughly equivalent to saying a Labrador is modest by Great Dane standards, added a visual energy to the rear quarters that made the car look as though it was moving even when it was parked. The PA rode on a separate chassis, not a unitary body construction, which was the direction the industry was beginning to move toward, with independent front suspension and a live rear axle. Under the bonnet sat a 2,262 cubic centimeters overhead valve 6-cylinder engine producing, in the figures that Vauxhall published for the period, approximately 83 brake horsepower. For a car of the PA's size and weight in 1957, that was adequate rather than energetic. The engine was later enlarged to 2,651 cubic centimeters during the production run, bringing the power output to a more confident level. That period road tests noted with approval. The transmission options included a 3-speed column change manual, the gear selector mounted on the steering column rather than the floor, which was the American convention and which British drivers either found elegantly modern or bewilderingly counterintuitive, depending on their previous experience. A Hydra-matic automatic transmission was also available, another GM inheritance that placed the Cresta in company that for 1957 Britain was genuinely exclusive. Automatic transmission in a British car of this class was a mark of serious arrival. The interior matched the exterior's ambitions: broad bench seating front and rear, generous headroom that acknowledged the panoramic glass house without making the cabin feel exposed, a dashboard that arranged its instruments and controls with a kind of confident symmetry that borrowed from American practice, while remaining recognizably tailored for British driving. The PA was not a small car by British standards of the period. Its width in particular required some adjustment from drivers accustomed to the narrower products of the domestic industry. But it was never ungainly. The proportions held together in a way that reflected careful attention to scale. A higher specification variant, The Cresta, in county trim, offered additional equipment and a finish level that elevated the car into territory where it was competing not just with other volume manufacturers, but with the lower reaches of the more prestigious British marques. That was, for Vauxhall, a new kind of ambition. How Britain received it. The press reception for the PA Cresta was not uniformly enthusiastic, and the reservations that appeared in the motoring journals of the period are worth examining because they tell you something useful about the gap between what the car was trying to do and what certain segments of the British automotive establishment were prepared to accept. Autocar and motor, the institutions of British car journalism in the late 1950s, tested the PA with the kind of measured professionalism that had served them well through decades of evaluating everything from pre-war tourers to utility vehicles. Their verdict on the Cresta was broadly positive about the engineering and notably cautious about the styling. The panoramic windscreen drew comment. It offered excellent forward vision, but introduced a degree of distortion at the extreme edges that some drivers found disorienting, particularly when judging the car's width in confined spaces, which, given the PA's dimensions, was not an uncommon challenge on British roads. The column change gear change was acknowledged as functional. The ride quality on British surfaces, which in the late 1950s included a substantial inventory of roads that had not been comprehensively maintained since before the war, was assessed as comfortable for its class. What the specialist press was less willing to celebrate was what the general public was, quietly and in considerable numbers, enthusiastic about. The Cresta sold well. It found its buyers without difficulty because those buyers knew exactly what they were purchasing and why, and the reservations of a road tester in Twickenham about the authenticity of the styling were not a significant factor in the decision made by a sales manager in Wolverhampton who wanted a car that his clients would notice on the forecourt. The Cresta also appeared in precisely the cultural locations where aspiration was being mapped in late 1950s, Britain. It was the car of the television commercial, the car that appeared in the background of the kind of middle-class domestic scenes that the new commercial television channel, ITV, had launched in 1955, was staging to sell everything from washing powder to life insurance. It was the car that certain members of an emerging criminal class drove in the crime films of the early 1960s, which conferred on it a glamour that Vauxhall's marketing department would neither have sought nor entirely discouraged. Remember what I said at the beginning, that there was something specific about how this car came to exist that casts everything else differently. Here it is. The PA Cresta was not designed in Britain. It was styled under the influence of a design philosophy developed in Detroit by men who had never driven on a British B-road in their lives and who, frankly, had not been asked to. General Motors' decision to let American styling lead the PAs. Development was a corporate choice, not an engineering one, and the consequence was a car that was genuinely too wide for a meaningful proportion of the roads it would travel, that burned more fuel than the island's recent history of rationing had conditioned its buyers to expect, and that required parking in spaces that its dimensions made a genuine exercise in spatial reasoning, none of which stopped its selling, none of which prevented it from becoming, for a specific and clearly defined segment of British society, the car that said exactly what they needed it to say. The total production run of the PA Cresta across its full life from 1957 to 1962 was substantial enough to ensure the model's commercial success for Vauxhall, though precise figures across all variants have been subject to some variance in the historical record, and I would rather acknowledge that uncertainty than offer a figure with false confidence. What is clear is that the Velox, mechanically similar but more plainly trimmed stablemate, sold alongside it to buyers who wanted the PA's mechanical package without the chromework, and that the combined production of the two models represented a significant share of the mid-range British car market during those years. Legacy and what they are worth today. The PA Cresta was replaced in 1962 by the PB, a car that refined its predecessor's formula without fundamentally challenging it. The PB in turn gave way to the PC in 1965, by which point the original PA's American exuberance had been progressively domesticated into something more in keeping with the cleaner, more European aesthetic direction that British car design was taking as the 1960s found their confidence. But the PA did not disappear quietly. It lingered in the national memory in the way that genuinely distinctive cars tend to, not as an object of universal affection, but as an unmistakable presence that triggered recognition in people who had never owned one. If you were of a certain age and you saw a PA Cresta on a British road in the 1970s or 80s, still running, still carrying its fins and its chrome and its two-tone paint through a world that had moved emphatically on, you noticed it. The car had the quality of a strong face, not necessarily a beautiful one, but one that you remembered. In the classic car market today, the PA occupies a position that reflects both its rarity and its character. The survival rate for large British saloons of the late 1950s is not high. These were working cars, driven hard, and maintained with varying degrees of care, and the combination of British weather and the economics of repair meant that many of them were simply used until they stopped, and then allowed to depart the inventory without ceremony. A genuine, well-preserved PA Cresta, particularly one in an original two-tone colour combination with its chrome intact and its interior in presentable condition, is now a genuinely unusual thing. At major British classic car auctions, a quality PA Cresta in the period from roughly 2015 onward has commanded prices that would have surprised the men who once drove them to work. Concours standard, examples in sought-after colour combinations and with verifiable history have achieved results at auction that reflect serious collector interest rather than casual nostalgia. The precise figures vary by event, condition, and specification, and I would encourage anyone with serious buying intent to review recent results from H&H Classics and Brightwell's, both of which have handled PA material in recent years, rather than rely on any general figure stated here. What is consistent across the market is the direction. The PA Cresta is going the way of all genuinely distinctive post-war British cars, upward in value as surviving examples become fewer, as the generation that remembers them from childhood reaches the age at which they can afford to own them, and as the broader classic car community comes to appreciate that the PA's styling, once dismissed as brash or derivative, is in fact one of the most purely characterful expressions of a specific cultural moment that British automotive history contains. Frankly, it may be the most underestimated car of its decade. The evidence was always there. It has just taken the market 60 years to read it properly. The Vauxhall Cresta PA ran for 5 years, from 1957 to 1962. In those 5 years, it sold to buyers who wanted, perhaps for the first time in their lives, a car that was more than transport. It arrived in a country emerging from genuine austerity, wearing the styling language of a culture that had never been rationed for anything in living memory, and it asked British buyers to decide whether they were ready to believe that the hard years were behind them. Most of them, it turned out, were. There is something in that transaction between a car designed in the shadow of American abundance and a country that was only just learning to reach for it, that tells you more about the Britain of the late 1950s than any sociological survey could manage. The men who bought Crestas were not naive. They understood the car's American origins. They understood that the fins were inherited rather than indigenous, and that the panoramic glass was a GM idea, applied to Luton-built steel. None of that diminished what the car meant to them. If anything, it was part of the point. The American reference was not embarrassing. It was the entire message. What the PA's story ultimately illustrates is that a car does not need to be perfect or original or critically approved to be genuinely important. It needs to arrive at the right moment, carrying the right meaning for the right people. The Cresta PA did all three. The fact that it did so on roads that were sometimes barely wide enough to accommodate its ambitions is not a flaw in the story. It is the story. Now I want to hear from you. Did you ride in a Cresta as a child? Your father's, your uncle's, a neighbour's? Did you ever own one, and if so, what did it cost you to keep that chrome in any kind of condition through a British winter? Or do you simply remember seeing one and understanding, even then, that it was a car that meant something? Leave it in the comments. The people watching this video have memories of these cars that no archive holds, and I would rather read what you remember than any auction catalogue. If this was worth your time, a like and a subscription would be genuinely appreciated. These scripts take longer to research and write than the running time might suggest, and an audience that takes this history seriously is what makes that work worth doing. Thank you for watching.